The bells began ringing before dawn, not to warn, but to summon. In the narrow streets of Paris, doors were smashed open, names were shouted, and blades flashed in torchlight. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families were dragged into the streets. Blood ran into the gutters as the city awakened to betrayal. By nightfall, the Seine carried bodies, and Europe realized too late that a single signal had unleashed a massacre no prayer could stop.
Paris, in August 1572, stood on the edge of celebration. Noble banners filled the streets, inns overflowed with guests, and church bells rang in apparent harmony. The marriage of Margaret of Valois, sister to the Catholic King Charles IX and Henry of Navarre, a Protestant leader, was meant to seal peace after decades of religious war. Thousands of Huguenots entered the city under royal promise of safety, believing reconciliation had finally replaced bloodshed. Beneath the surface, resentment festered. Catholic Parisians viewed the Protestant presence as an invasion sanctioned by weakness. Sermons warned of heresy poisoning France from within. Pamphlets circulated accusing Protestants of conspiracy and blasphemy. The fragile peace depended on trust, and trust was already cracking. At the center of this tension stood Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most respected Huguenot leader, whose influence over the young king alarmed powerful Catholic factions. On August 22, an assassin's bullet struck Coligny as he returned to his lodgings. Though wounded, he survived. Protestants demanded justice. Catholics feared retaliation. The royal court descended into panic. Catherine de' Medici, the king's mother, and her allies convinced Charles that Coligny and the Huguenot elite posed an imminent threat. Fear hardened into resolve. What began as a plan to eliminate a few leaders evolved into something far more destructive. In the early hours of August 24, the feast day of Saint Bartholomew, the signal was given. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang through the darkness. Armed men moved through the city with lists of names. Doors marked with chalk were forced open. Coligny was among the first to die, his body defiled and thrown into the street. The killings spread faster than orders could restrain them. Ordinary citizens joined the violence. Old grudges found permission. Religious hatred became personal. Men, women, and children were slaughtered without trial or mercy. Bodies were stripped, mutilated, and dumped into the Seine. The city transformed into a maze of screams, smoke, and iron. What was meant to be controlled assassinations became an uncontrollable purge. By sunrise, Paris belonged to the killers. The king's authority dissolved into chaos as the massacre fed on itself. The streets were choked with corpses, and the river ran dark with blood. The promise of peace lay shattered, replaced by a realization that the night had only begun, and Paris was merely the first stage.
The violence did not end with dawn. As sunlight revealed the scale of what had occurred, restraint vanished entirely. Groups of armed civilians roamed Paris, hunting those who had survived the night by hiding in cellars, attics, and monasteries. Houses were searched methodically. Anyone suspected of Protestant faith was dragged into the streets. Some were offered conversion at sword point, others were killed without a word. The distinction between soldier and civilian dissolved as the city surrendered to frenzy. Royal proclamations arrived too late and carried little authority. When Charles IX attempted to halt the bloodshed, his voice was drowned by the momentum he had helped unleash. Guards who should have enforced order instead participated. The crown's endorsement, once given, could not be withdrawn. Paris understood the massacre as permission, and permission became excess. The killing turned celebratory. Bodies were displayed in doorways. Severed heads were paraded through streets as proof of loyalty. News traveled quickly beyond the capital. In cities like Orleans, Lyon, Bordeaux, and Toulouse, the events in Paris were interpreted as royal approval for action. Local leaders faced a choice between restraint and imitation. Many chose the latter. Within weeks, coordinated violence erupted across France. Protestants were hunted in their homes, churches, and fields. Entire communities vanished in days. The massacre became national, though it would forever bear the name of its birthplace. For the Huguenots, the betrayal cut deeper than the losses themselves. They had entered Paris under explicit royal protection. Their leaders had dined with the king. The marriage meant to symbolize unity had instead become a trap. Survivors fled where they could, abandoning property, families, and faith openly practiced only days before. France's roads filled with refugees carrying nothing but memory and fear. Abroad, reactions were divided. Catholic rulers praised the purge as a defense of true faith. Protestant states responded with horror and outrage. In Rome, celebrations were held. In London and Geneva, bells tolled in mourning. France's reputation fractured overnight. What had been a powerful kingdom seeking unity now appeared unpredictable, ruled by fear rather than law. Diplomacy hardened, trust evaporated. Inside Paris, the aftermath was grim. Corpses clogged the Seine until the water could no longer carry them away. The stench lingered for weeks. Mass graves were dug hurriedly, without ceremony. Survivors avoided speaking aloud, unsure who might listen. Silence became a survival strategy. The city that had once hosted reconciliation now feared its own shadows. The massacre altered the nature of France's religious wars. Compromise became impossible. If peace could be betrayed so completely, then only victory or annihilation remained. Violence no longer shocked, it instructed. Future conflicts would remember St. Bartholomew's Day as proof that mercy was weakness and coexistence a lie. Yet even as the killings spread, no official record acknowledged their full extent. Numbers were disputed, minimized, manipulated. Responsibility blurred between crown, clergy, and crowd. This ambiguity protected those who had initiated the violence while condemning the victims to statistical uncertainty. History would argue over totals, but not over intent. The night had revealed how quickly order could collapse when fear was crowned king.
As the violence subsided, France did not return to peace, but to exhaustion. Entire districts stood emptied, their doors broken, their interiors stripped bare. Shops reopened beside blood-stained stones. Markets resumed, while names of the dead circulated in whispers. Life continued, not because wounds had healed, but because survival demanded amnesia. The massacre had altered the social fabric, teaching people what the state would allow and what it would deny. For King Charles IX, the consequences were immediate and personal. He publicly accepted responsibility, declaring that the killings were necessary to prevent rebellion. Privately, he unraveled. Witnesses later described him pacing endlessly, haunted by visions of blood and voices. Authority had saved the throne, but fractured the man who occupied it. His reign would never recover from the decision made in fear during that August night. Catherine de' Medici remained composed. To her allies, the massacre was a grim necessity, a calculated act to preserve royal power in a divided kingdom. To her enemies, she became its architect, a symbol of cold political brutality. Whether she had planned mass murder or merely unleashed forces she could not control became a matter of historical debate. What remained undeniable was that her influence had shaped the moment when restraint gave way to annihilation. The Protestant cause hardened. Those who survived no longer believed in royal promises. Armed resistance intensified. Fortified cities became refuges. religious war resumed with renewed ferocity, now fueled by memory as much as ideology. The massacre was cited again and again as justification for future violence. Each side claimed defense. Each carried its own dead as proof. Internationally, the event reshaped alliances. Protestant nations viewed France as treacherous. Catholic powers praised its resolve, but hesitated to trust its stability. The massacre had demonstrated that internal unity could be enforced through terror, but also that such unity was brittle. France stood powerful, yet isolated, feared rather than respected. In Paris, the physical traces slowly faded, but psychological scars endured. Children grew up hearing fragments of the night spoken in hushed tones. Survivors avoided certain streets. Some refused to ring church bells ever again. Memory embedded itself in routine, shaping behavior long after blood had been washed from stone. Chroniclers attempted to impose order on chaos. Accounts varied wildly. Some described divine judgment, others portrayed uncontrolled mob violence. Few confronted the uncomfortable truth that authority and crowd had acted together. By framing the massacre as spontaneous, responsibility dissolved. By framing it as planned, it became politically dangerous. The truth lay in the space between intention and opportunity. What St. Bartholomew's Day ultimately revealed was not merely religious hatred, but the fragility of civil order when fear is legitimized. The killings were not inevitable, they were chosen. That choice echoed forward, redefining how power could be exercised in moments of crisis. Once demonstrated, it could be repeated. France moved on, but it did so altered. Trust between ruler and subject had been broken in a way no treaty could repair. The massacre lingered as a warning embedded in history. When the state abandons protection, survival becomes suspicion, and neighbors become threats waiting for a signal. In the years that followed, St. Bartholomew's Day became less an event than a shadow stretching across generations. It was invoked in sermons, political debates, and private arguments as proof of what faith and authority could justify when fear outweighed restraint. No monument marked the sites of slaughter. No official day of mourning was declared. The absence of acknowledgement became part of the legacy, teaching that silence could be as powerful as decree. Historians would later argue over numbers, intent, and culpability, but such disputes obscured a simpler truth. The massacre succeeded not because it was carefully planned, but because it was permitted. Once the signal sounded, restraint collapsed everywhere it had been fragile. The machinery of the state did not need to command each act, it needed only to step aside. In that space, violence multiplied on its own logic. For the survivors, memory carried practical consequences. Many concealed their faith, practiced in secret, or fled the kingdom entirely. Others hardened, concluding that coexistence was an illusion sustained only until power shifted. The idea of tolerance suffered a wound that would take centuries to heal. What had been framed as a single night of necessity became a permanent argument against trust. France's monarchy endured, but at a cost. Authority preserved itself through fear, and fear reshaped the relationship between ruler and ruled. Obedience could be demanded, but loyalty could not. Each subsequent crisis carried the echo of bells at dawn, a reminder that protection was conditional. Stability was maintained, yet it rested on memory rather than confidence. Across Europe, the massacre entered collective consciousness as a warning. It demonstrated that civil collapse did not require invasion or famine, only permission. The lesson was absorbed unevenly.
sometimes ignored, sometimes repeated. Where leaders faced division, St. Bartholomew's Day offered both a precedent and an excuse. Over time, the night lost some of its immediacy, but not its meaning. It survived in language, in distrust, in the careful calculations of power. The Seine continued to flow, markets thrived, and Paris rebuilt its image. Yet beneath renewal lay an unresolved reckoning. The victims remained unnamed, their deaths absorbed into narrative rather than justice. What endures is not the spectacle of violence, but the mechanism that allowed it. A signal given in fear, accepted in hatred, and executed by ordinary people convinced they were acting lawfully. That is the lasting terror of St. Bartholomew's Day. Not that it happened once, but that it revealed how easily it could happen again, whenever authority decides that protection no longer applies.